All right. Thank you all very much for the conversation we've been having so far, and thanks, of course, to Alexis and Sasha for organizing this. It's wonderful to be here. My topic for today is mostly grief. We'll discuss exactly what we might mean by grief as we go along, but I'm interested in whether grief has a transformative quality, and I think in some cases it does. And not just that, I suspect that the account that exists currently out there can be enriched by an attempt to make sense of that transformative quality as an integrated whole, a gestalt, or une totalité, to use the word that was used to translate from Dewey. But I'm influenced by Irvin Yalom and other existential psychotherapists, and that's partially where I'm coming from. So there's a nice little quote there. Let me adapt some of Nietzsche's words and say this to you. To become wise, you must learn to listen to the wild dogs barking in your cellar. And I think this is an invitation for us as philosophers, people like me, who often stray quite far away from the realm of what Jung called the shadow, to take it a lot more seriously. And this is my attempt. I begin this conversation with an initial juxtaposition of thoughts because they're, in a way, banal thoughts. The first one is that it's actually quite difficult to think about death in general and your own in particular. So there's a nice quote from La Rochefoucauld: "Death, like the sun, cannot be looked at steadily. It's difficult to keep gazing into it." And yet it's also true that it's the most banal thing in the world to say that we're all going to die. So there's a nice song by Marvin Gaye called Trouble Man, where he says only three things, that's for sure: taxes, death, and trouble. I think somehow, some way, we live with this juxtaposition all the time, and we don't really interrogate it, but that's kind of my attempt of what we're going to do today. When I first presented this idea to a friend who happens to be of faith, he pointed out that my approach might be somehow failing to recognize the fact that people who have a transcendental worldview or a religious orientation might be somehow put off by the framing that I'm going to offer. But I want to put it to you that even if you have faith in the beyond, being somehow rich or better than the world that we're living in now, there's a unique experience of what it's like to be the kind of people that we are, human beings who are finite, who experience the loss of people they love. That is it, in fact, shared, even if we have beliefs about that beyond. And so there's a nice quote here by Morris Manning, who says that we cannot, as conscious human beings, easily contemplate our non-existence, even if our faith involves a belief in eternal life. We need to find places from which we can peer briefly at this great blinding darkness, whose only purpose is to underline the magnificence of life itself. Such places offer only a partial perspective. However, if we persist, we can, in time, form a picture. Okay, how can we actually do this? What's one way of basically taming the great darkness that is death? One way is by oblique. It's by actually witnessing the death of others, the death of those we love. And the most obvious way of experiencing that is to experience grief. I am currently in a period of grief. I'm going to be perfectly transparent with you. I've lost several people very recently in my life, and so this is a text I'm writing from an authentic place of experienced grief. But I've also been reading philosophers who have various things to say about grief, and one important philosopher on grief is Michael Cholby, who's from the University of Edinburgh, and he says that grief is our response, and it's a usually fairly rich emotionally response to transformations in our relationships with other people or possibly other things, where those are the kinds of relationships that we're invested our identity in, that are central to how we think of ourselves, that are sources of our reasons for doing what we do day to day in the world. That strikes me as basically true, but as failing to note some important features of grief. And the first one is that grief can be a mere passing emotion. For a lot of people, that's a common way of using the word in English. I'm told that deuil in French is much less loosely used. I'll leave it to you to correct me later if you have intuitions about that. But it's also a typically painful and unchosen emotion, even if it might last or not. It can be a transformative process. It isn't always, but it can be. I'll be trying to figure out the context or the conditions within which it is transformative and why we might think it has some transformative qualities. It's an encounter with profound loss. So bereavement is the paradigmatic case. Again, I'm told by people who live in the French language day to day that deuil, when you say that in French, typically means bereavement rather than grief. But I'm told that more and more the flexibilization of the French language means that you can kind of make it work. So I'm hoping this flows well enough in your own inner language. Bless you. It's also an experience of intense fragility and typically of powerlessness. And I'm going to argue that, at least in the transformative context, it is a call for moral transformation because it responds to that particular vulnerability. Now, you'll have heard about the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, and I'm not going to talk about it very much, except as to say that there are certain expectations that people have about grief, that it's at least got a predictable shape, but it's quite often the case that it's just not true. Most people have extremely messy experiences of grief, and the ways in which they process that grief are actually quite unpredictable. Nevertheless, we have a particular kind of problem. We're trying to figure out what's the difference between passing grief and grief that is itself transformative. And one attempt to make sense of what could distinguish that ordinary, everyday kind of feeling of grief about something from grief as the kind of experience that transforms your relationship to yourself is to have a retrospective account, to look backwards. And in short, that retrospective account tells us that severity, duration, and the transformative quality of grief are a direct consequence of the antecedent value that we ascribe to the lost object. It's a fairly economistic form of reasoning that boils down to the following thought. The bigger the loss, the bigger the dislocation, the more pain you experience, and the longer the grief, and therefore the longer or greater the transformation. And typically these are all run together. It also typically implies a kind of passivity to it, something that is just something you undergo rather than something that you are participating in as an active agent. And honestly, this account is fairly popular. People tend to find it credible. They tend to think this is a reasonable way of distinguishing passing grief, which is about basically things that don't matter that much to you being lost in your life, and transformative or profound grief that's about things that mattered a lot more to you for a variety of reasons. And in fact, a lot of people do experience grief in just this way. So I'm going to actually throw this out there more as a prompt for discussion for myself and for you, which is that in Freud's libidinal account of mourning, of grief, you find some elements of this account. So, for example, if I quote him directly, he says that reality testing, once you're in a mourning phase, has shown that the love object no longer exists, and it proceeds to demand that all libido shall be withdrawn from its attachment to that object. And this demand arouses understandable opposition and can result in a turning away from reality and a clinging to the object through the medium of hallucinatory wishful psychosis. The fact is, however, that once the work of mourning is completed, the ego becomes free and inhibited again. Sorry, it should be uninhibited again. The cases that Freud has in mind is that when you are mourning very gravely, very deeply, you loved a partner or a parent, and once you've lost them, you have to spend a long period of time shifting your economy of emotions to make it balanced in a way that makes it possible to keep going forwards. And he goes on to say, in mourning, we found that the inhibition and loss of interest are fully accounted for by the work of mourning in which the ego is absorbed. And in other words, mourning or grieving is the process of simply shifting past invested emotional relationship into some new potential, right? And so you can see this kind of dependency on the past being the explanation for why mourning might be difficult or challenging in proportion to the invested energy or emotion. Okay, an obvious problem is that people just don't always grieve in proportion to the value they consciously place on the lost love object. People are often surprised. An extremely difficult loss from the perspective of the perceived griever might come from the loss of someone they actually hate. This is a common experience, believe it or not. So if you ask them what the valence was that they've put on their emotional attitude towards that object, it would have been negative, and yet they experienced genuine painful loss and grieving. In other times, people might have had a very deep, close relationship with someone, but fairly healthy, this is an indicative case, and can actually go through relatively, I wouldn't say pain-free, but manageable pain and short grieving, which doesn't necessarily have the transformative quality you might have expected it would have. So one answer, which is an obvious answer, is that when Freud was writing, he had in mind an unconscious libidinal value, so we shouldn't really pay attention to the conscious relationships we have to objects or people. That's just sort of misleading. And that's a reasonable answer, and that would be another paper if I went down that route. But for our purposes, I just want to suggest that there is another route here, which is to suggest that we should pay attention to the fact that grief involves a relationship to the future, not just to the past. And therefore, we're going to have another or a different kind of account to that difference between grief that's light and grief that's profound. And so this future-oriented or proleptic account has been well articulated by a really nice paper by Jelena Markovic, who was doing a PhD at UBC and a postdoc after that, I believe. It's called Transformative Grief. It's in the European Journal of Philosophy. It's a really, really nice paper. And I want to use it to build on it, kind of my own account on top of it. So Markovic distinguishes between instances of grief that do not call forth transformation and those that do, by drawing on Laurie Paul's account of transformative experiences. So Laurie Paul wrote a really nice book in 2014 that's on a particular account of transformative experiences, and I'll try to explain a little bit what that involves as we go along. Crucially, though, in Markovic's word, Paul's account tells us that transformative experiences are those in which the agent learns something that they didn't know before, and that they're transformed in their own relationship to themselves. So transformative experiences teach the agent something that they could not have known without having that experience. So it's epistemically transformative and changes the agent's point of view and core desires and preferences. It's personally transformative. Here are some examples of transformative experiences. Laurie Paul's central example is becoming a parent. Other examples are gaining a sense modality. So for example, if you were blind for most of your life and you eventually are lucky enough to regain eyesight, you may have a transformative experience. There's also falling in love as an example, falling gravely ill or becoming disabled, experiencing war or other tragic conditions, including potentially knowing that you're going to die, are examples of transformative experiences. Now in Paul's case, maybe the most idiosyncratic proposal is that the agent really fundamentally changes in terms of their preferences in response to the world. So who they were before could not have anticipated the preferences that they would have after the experience of these transformative experiences. And you can kind of think this in decision theory, for those who are interested in this kind of way of parsing it. Then decision theory, you can usually establish a rank order preferences for a rational agent. And the idea is that certain kind of experiences just fundamentally dislocate that sense of preference ranking. So in the case of Markovic's paper, what we find is that the grief-related transformation is future-orientated, agential, and holistic, since the self is transformed by grief as this deeper process in 4 ways. The first is cognitively, by altering or forcing a person to alter a wide range of their beliefs and desires. I think the cognitive dimension, that's kind of most obvious, is that you have to believe something new about the world. The second is phenomenologically, by disrupting the taken for granted background structure of a person's experience. And so this is maybe a schema that you might hold unconsciously about the way the world functions and how you can expect to experience the world on a day-to-day basis. The third is normatively, by being at a loss, you've lost an object of practical identity investment, and thus requiring a person to review and or revise their practical identity. That means you have to evaluate or change the ways in which you make decisions in terms of your practical rationality. And the fourth is existentially, by forcing a practical acquaintance with a structuring condition of one's life. Typically, when we're talking about grieving, we're talking about minimally the fact that you can't go back in time. That's the simplest way to put it, that something has happened and you can't undo it. Okay, this demands that we renegotiate various features of one's future-orientated identity and agency. Markovic goes on to explain that grief as process, as I'm calling it, as an experience, must be more than just an adjustment to a loss. Grief as emotion can be an adjustment to a loss, can be passing, but this has to be more demanding than that. The loss itself must be valuable, but the manner in which that value is expressed is actually plural. She says that this can be captured by the notion, for instance, of an investment of one's practical identity. So it's something or someone being very important to my own sense of who I am in the world, but also importance to one's own flourishing. So it could be the case that I directly experience the lost object or person as benefiting me in my own life pursuits. Inclusion in one's orientation to the future, or the presence of a system of possibilities associated with the lost object. These are all fairly future-oriented ways of parsing the value that when we had first looked at the retrospective account seemed to be just about how we had felt or how we felt invested in a past relationship. She goes on to add that it's not only an adjustment to a loss, but an avowal of its value. There is a component of dedication or honoring of the lost object. In other words, to grieve is to celebrate in a specific kind of way the relationship that we may have held. That celebration or honoring might take forms that are surprising, but nevertheless are important to us. So what I'm interested in is whether there might be an underpinning psychological mechanism to the account that Markovitch proposes. And I do think there is at least a hypothesis that we should prod further, and that is that profound grief is not just an experience composed of parts in the way Markovitch presents it to us. She gives us kind of 4 elements and she presents them as parts. But it's actually an interaction with an integrated whole, with a gestalt, with something that we experience as being greater than the sum of its parts. It is, in a sense, very difficult to put words on it precisely because it hits us as something that's so totalizing in its qualities. But at the same time, it does have some discernible features that are not reducible to the parts. And I'm going to attempt to characterize that integrated whole. Okay, how should we do that? I think that profound grief puts us in unmediated contact with a specific feature of what existentialists like to call our facticity. So features of our life that are not chosen by us. And that is that continued living comes at the price of a future marked by continued grief. And that is that we will probably continue to grieve the past lost object, and we are pretty certain that we will grieve again, even if we are not grieving, bless you, even if we happen to be grieving our own future demise, we certainly will grieve something. In short, what I'm trying to say is that we experience a shattering when we experience grief, a shattering of the near constant disavowal of our profound, raw, and unfairly distributed existential vulnerability, and of our exposure to grief itself. That is, that we're aware that we are going to die, but we're also aware that others that we love will also die. Put another way, whatever it is that you love, whether that's a person or an object, you are aware of its vulnerability. And from that point onwards, we continually remember, more or less consciously at different times because it's very unpleasant, this shattering, and we live in the shadow of its dreaded full resurgence because it can be crushing. How does this reveal itself to the griever? We have an immediate, sometimes visceral awareness of one's own eventual demise. I think this comes in the form of feelings captured by the phrase, "But for the grace of God go I." We might know that something very bad has happened to someone else, but we immediately experience the fact that this is relevant to us in a certain kind of way. Their thou-ness speaks to my I-ness. I recognize myself in them. The second is a threatening, looming sense of the eventual death of other loved ones. When one person is lost, or when one love object is lost, it becomes very obvious that others are subject to the same reality. The third is a dim but scary awareness of the fact that we never quite finish grieving anything. The grief just becomes a part of us. What I have here in mind is that for those of you who have experienced profound grief, it's usually the case that it resurfaces, minimally cyclically, typically around the same time of year, but quite often maybe if it's of a loved one at their birthday or at the date of their death. And there will also often be intrusive thoughts. Even if you're having a good time, having a grand old time doing whatever it is, you'll remember the fact that that person's not around, and that will be something that hits you pretty hard and meaningfully. And so that dim awareness never really leaves us. even though we do everything we can to make it go away. Fourthly, in a very real sense, I think that grief reveals to the self that it can never return to its previous state of unawareness of that fragility. There is really, in a sense, no going back. And what I have in mind here is that even though grief can feel very different depending on the object that you're grieving, there is a recurrent quality, I think, for most people, which is the fundamental fact that this is a different way of being in the world. When you're not grieving, when you're not consciously grieving, there is a sense of lightness that is not accessible to you when you are in profound grief. And that sense of weight, of heaviness, eludes, I think, the words that would naturally characterize most things that we would recognize as manageable emotions. It kind of involves a difficulty in doing so. Okay, I'm rushing on, and we're almost at the end. So what exactly should we make of this when it comes to the possibility of profound moral transformation if we encounter something that's just so difficult and frightening? Well, I think here that there's the obvious dimension that Markovitch points out, and that's the existential dimension of grief confronts us to our finitude, and that can be valuable in its own way. We know there's a long tradition of memento mori, typically and very well captured in the artistic dimension, that just being aware of my own death can be something that's valuable for me. It can be edifying. It can help me specify and understand myself and the values that I have in the world, and make a demand on me to be better than I was before. But I think that if we really affirm the fact that grief itself is shoving in our face the inescapability of a certain kind of uncontrollable, endless grieving, then I think it constitutes a direct encounter with, in fact, a call for deep transformation as the background soundtrack to whatever amount of life remains for us and the people we love. And so we encounter the mourner's journey through what I'm calling the wilderness of grief. I'm borrowing this from rabbinical sources, actually. It seems like that's a phrase used. And it thus affirms that we are, in a concrete sense, a part of the wild, of wilderness. And that wilderness is fragile. It's also violent in a certain kind of way because it's inscrutable, so it's threatening like large waves at sea. And it is impermanent, even though there seems to be some quality to it that is maybe hidden and behind, that is permanent, but we experience it in its impermanent features. And so I'm very drawn to Martin Buber's language here, and I think that what we're talking about is that this transformative experience puts us in a kind of relationship where an I-it relationship with others and with nature can become an I-thou relationship, because in the experience of grieving, we are brought into direct contact with a somewhat ineffable quality of the fundamental vulnerability of the other. And for what it's worth, I could have also parsed this out in Levinasian terms, because I think that confronting the face or the skin, that is what he talks about. These are also ways of being in direct contact with something deeply vulnerable in the other that calls to the self. Thank you very much.